Welcome everyone to the first episode of season 3 of BMF. I'm here to cover every single episode this season, so make sure to like and subscribe and turn on your notifications. These recaps will normally be airing roughly a couple minutes after each episode ends on Friday night. So here we are, Detroit versus everybody's name of this episode. The real big thing about this season is now we have Lil Meech, or Meech in the show, has relocated to Atlanta while Terry is staying up in Detroit. So now we have a split in leadership and a divide in leadership qualities. How is that going to affect the BMF empire? Is it going to be able to expand, or is it going to implode from within? And is Meech going to be able to survive in this new environment of Atlanta? So a lot of this season is going to hinge on how well Atlanta is developed, early 90s Atlanta, which is drastically different from the Atlanta that we have now. And I do believe so far the BMS show has captured that perfectly. One thing that stands out to me that a lot of people might not be aware of is the projects that were in Atlanta before the Olympics came in. All those projects, there were dozens of them, were basically raised to make room for the Olympics and to show that, this is a safe environment. There's no crime down here. One of the most infamous projects was the Techwood projects, which takes center stage here. This is one of the antagonists that Meech is going to be going against. And the leader of the Techwood projects is a guy by the name of, what do they call his name? Remy Ransom is the name, played by Jason Lowder. So Remy Ransom has an interesting background, which also ties into the entire history of Atlanta. His background is that he's almost like a Robin Hood figure within the Techwood projects, and the residents there have a lot of love for him and they protect him. And part of his benevolent heart comes from the fact that he lost a sibling in the Atlanta child murders that happened in the early 80s, the infamous murders that a lot of people feel wasn't completely solved, even though someone got convicted of the crime. So all that is tying into this season. These little tidbits that they're putting in really brings the city alive with the true history that went on in Atlanta in the early 90s. One of the most important things also was spotlighting the Red Dogs unit, which is an acronym that stands for Run Every Drug Dealer Out of Georgia. They were infamous in Georgia. They were actually, I didn't get down in Atlanta until 1999, and they were still active then. They didn't get disbanded until 2011 after a bunch of multi-million dollar lawsuits for police brutality, a lot of complaints from the citizens, and we see that spotlighted here in the opening episode, where they get out of their cars and start beating on Remy Ransom and his entire crew with impunity. So I want to see how they're spotlighted throughout the entire season, but I think they're going to play a big role in disrupting that war. They haven't gotten to Meech yet, but they're already, just running rampant over the Techwood projects. The other antagonist that's rooted in history in the show is a group called the Miami Killers, is what they're called on the show. But in reality, they were known as the Miami Boys, basically drug dealers that came up from Florida that set up shop in Atlanta. They were loosely knit, but they were known for their ruthlessness, their high-powered weaponry. There's a lot of shootouts that happened out in the street. So we see a glimpse of that too, where there's a shootout when there's a drop. Originally, it's a shootout between the Techwood boys and Meech's crew, and then the Miami Killers just show up and they're taking out both of them. They don't have any allegiance to anyone but themselves. The one downside I think so far is that unlike the Techwood projects that are represented by Remy, the Miami boys don't really have like a charismatic leader yet. There was one guy that they referenced in the show, but he doesn't really stand out like Remy does. So I think they'll need to rectify that to really show them as a complete force and unit as the show goes on. Also, some of the killings that we see in the show is rooted in real life killings that happen in Atlanta, as far as the styles of killings that they did back then when they were having these drug wars. A good example is at the end of the episode, Remy and his crew, they literally drag one of Meech's boys, his lifeless body, out of the car and dump him in front of Meech as a show of aggression that, we're going to run you guys out of here. That was really the type of killings they did back then. There was a story from 1988. A young man, early 20s, by the name of Ronald Baker, was killed the exact same way. They killed him, had him in the car, and then dumped him on the side of the road. They didn't dump him in front of his crew, but that kind of style of killing was done regularly back in the 80s and the early 90s. So that type of scene was pulled directly from what was happening in the early 80s, or excuse me, late 80s, early 90s in Atlanta. So I think they've done a really good job of setting the scene and capturing how the environment was and how there were so many different competing crews with different mentalities and even different nationalities that were going on. The other thing that stood out was the new characters we got. So that was one thing I was worried about because we're dealing with a lot of celebrities that are coming on the show, and there's a big wonder of how good they're going to be able to act. Are they going to be basically playing themselves, or are they going to be able to really pull off these different characters? The first one is Neo. He's playing a guy called Rodney Greeny Green. He's basically like kind of a self-styled pimp. He's the guy that can get you with all the girls, all the clubs and everything. So that was pretty believable, just the way he was set up and all that. He seemed like the Atlanta OGs that I've come across. So I thought that was really played really well on his part. Now, Two Chains, he's playing a guy called Stacks. Now he's in Meech's crew, at least for now. Just the look on his face, he's not somebody I would trust. So we're going to see how long this lasts. I think Meech doesn't trust him too much either. He gives him a discount on the work, but it's really just to see if he's going to run his mouth and spread that throughout the city. So I think Meech already knows this isn't a guy to trust, even though by relation he's related to the late Ty's wife. You would think, this would be somebody that he can confide in, but just the way he's looking at Meech and all that, he sees him as an outsider. And I think Sax is somebody that doesn't like to be under anyone, especially somebody that's from out of town. So I think eventually he's gonna, betray Meech, either going to the Techwood side or possibly the Miami boys. Maybe not going with them because there's still a lot of beef there, but trying to set Meech up so Meech can get out of the picture and he can take over everything for himself. And I think that's going to be his undoing. But I thought Two Chainz was pretty convincing as an early 90s Atlanta doughboy. He definitely has that swag down, definitely has a distinct character about him. So we'll see how he develops throughout the season. But I think they've done a great job with the new characters, laying the new foundation in Atlanta. Because of that, I feel like Terry's storylines wasn't as strong because a lot of it was kind of a retread of what we've seen. He's dealing with the fallout from Markeisha being shot at. That wasn't really a big subplot because she's pretty much out of the hospital by the halfway point of the episode. And the person who was the perpetrator, DC Fly, he gets killed off camera, which I thought was kind of not a good move. Um, but it does lead to the big thing about Terry's leadership. How is he going to lead in Detroit without Meech behind him? Terry's style of leadership, I think, would work really well in the straight world. If he was in corporate America, somewhere like that, I think he can move up really well. But in this game, there needs to be a healthy amount of fear for people to stay in line. And I don't think he has that yet. Meech is pulling things behind the scenes to make sure that he's not getting his hands dirty directly as far as committing murders. And that's a way of insulating him. But I think in the long run, that's going to backfire because what's going to happen when the rest of the crew, realizes that Terry is not putting in any work. There was one character that said something that I thought I agreed with, where he said that, bosses shouldn't get their hands dirty when they get to that stage. That is true. But in order for everybody in the crew to respect you, they have to know that you're willing to put in work if necessary. And I think once this comes out that Terry's been lying about catching his body, I think that's going to cause some doubt with some members of the crew. And that's going to fracture his leadership potential or his leadership abilities with this new crew. Also, moving out of the record store that's been the home base, I think that's going to cause people to be a little bit uneasy too. So I think Terry's leadership is going to have to go through a lot of struggles in the first half of the season, which probably, unfortunately, is not going to be rectified until he kills somebody. And then when that happens, that's going to completely, change his demeanor and how he carries himself. He is moving out of the house. That is long overdue. And that brings me to the other storyline, which is Lucille and Charles. Um, Lucille is ready to go through with the divorce. She still loves him, obviously, but she cannot get over that type of betrayal. And I think that's reinforced by the fact that everyone in the church knows their business. She's just too embarrassed and too hurt to be able to move on. So I think her storyline is going to be continuing what is life after Charles. What is life as far as being able to be a single woman, managing the household, because we're assuming Charles is going to eventually leave. And then on Charles's end, he's a man without any power at this point. She told him point blank, you stopped being the head of the household a long time ago, basically when you stepped out. So now he doesn't have any authority. We saw that symbolized by the fact that his sons were giving their underlings keys to the house without even his permission. He's basically looked at as an afterthought, and he's struggling to find his place. Now, I do think there's going to be uh, a potential fallout for that people might not suspect. I think the fact that Terry is kind of following in his father's footsteps, unwittingly, I think this is going to bring Charles closer to his sons, but not in a good way. I think once he's out of the house, of course, they're going to be feeling like they have to keep him close and protect their dad. And I think he's going to fall too close into the business. I don't think he's going to be out there catching bodies and moving weight directly, but I think he's going to end up becoming a confidant for his sons and getting too close to the business. He shouldn't be. Remember how vehement he was against the drug dealing and all that in the first season, and he still tried to keep a healthy distance. You guys do what you do, and I just don't want to know all the details. But I think he's going to get deep into the details like that by the fact that he's out of the house and is not going to have anything else to fall back on. He's not going to be directly involved with his family and his children anymore. He's going to have to be able to put himself into something, and I think that's going to be Terry and Meech's business, to his detriment long term. Uh, the best line of the episode was from Lawanda and Markeisha when they got into it. Lawanda called her was a sack chasing hoe. So Lawanda had reason to be hot. He brought Markeisha to the house, didn't run that by anyone. So I hope we get a little bit more of that. Not too much, because we don't want it turning into reality TV. But this is definitely a hurtful situation for Lawanda, holding down the kids and everything. And Terry just kind of has his nose open with Markeisha, who's still a married woman. So we know this is going to go up in smoke at some point. But good starting episode. The main storylines is obviously this divided leadership, how that's going to work. How is Meech going to continue to build and negotiate in Atlanta? I think it's going to be a very good plot line because it can't be all force. It has to be coalition building. So we're going to see, we've already know how strong Meech is when it comes to force and putting in work. But now we're going to get to see more of his diplomacy and coalition building, which is going to be necessary to build the Atlanta Empire that we know happened later on into the early 2000s. So that's my recap of Detroit versus Everybody. Good starting episode. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll be back to cover every single episode immediately following the episode's end. So make sure to check back if you're an early bird, roughly around 1 a.m. on Friday. And if not, you can always check in after the episode airs officially on Stars at Friday at 9 p.m. So take care, and I will see you guys next week.